Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar, Our Daughters and Our Mothers, the Tragedy of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. My name is Len Rudner. On behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, I'm delighted to have you with us today. Today's webinar falls within the 16 days of activism that began on November 25th with International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and ends on December 10th, International Human Rights Day. This period of reflection and action also includes the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women in memory of the 14 women who were murdered at l'École Polytechnique de Montréal on December 6, 1989. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation is honored to make this contribution to the learning that is taking place across Canada during this time. A few administrative details before we begin. We will follow our usual format for webinars. We'll begin with the presentation of our guests, Hilda Anderson-Pers and Sandra de Laronde. At the end of the presentation, I'll return to assist with the Q&A section of the program. You may, as always, type your questions at any time during the presentation. My colleague and I will group or combine similar questions together in order to make the best use of our time. So now let us begin. In 2014, a report prepared by the RCMP stated that 1,181 Indigenous women were murdered or went missing between 1980 and 2012. During the same period, Indigenous women and girls, who make up only 4% of the female population in Canada, represented 16% of all female homicides. In response to advocacy from the Indigenous community, the Government of Canada in 2015 established a national inquiry to shed light on this tragedy and to understand and examine the report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The mandate of that commission is now drawing to an end, but the work must continue. Our speakers today will talk about the work of the Commission and what it means to all Canadians and to the national projects of healing and reconciliation. Hilda and Sandra, it's a great pleasure to have you join us. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody who's watching us online. I'm Hilda. And I'm Sandra. And together, we're going to present. No, we're the co-chairs for the Manitoba Coalition for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirited People. And we've been at this work, say, individually for our lifetimes, but more specifically around the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for the last couple of years. So our coalition is comprised of grassroots, frontline organizations and individuals, Indigenous organizations and individuals, primarily within the city of Winnipeg, but also representative across the province. It also includes representative political bodies, with the exception of the Manitoba Métis Federation. It's primarily within the context of an urban environment with BPAN and Indigenous, and outside of the city of Winnipeg, it is primarily a First Nations driven.
And I also, I'm currently employed as the manager of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Liaison Unit for the Manitoba Kiwetnik, which represents 27 Northern Manitoba First Nations, and I also sit as the co-chair of the MMIWG coalition here in Manitoba with Sandra.
Okay, so the inquiry there had been a call for an inquiry for at least 15 years, but the issue of missing and murdered, justice for missing and murdered loved ones certainly began with in our country with the tragic loss of or murder of Helen Betty Osborne in the Pas, Manitoba, which is the community I was raised in and kind of lived with this lack of justice for many years for Miss Osborne. And as well, a few years later was the death of Adame Akwash, one of the resistance fighters in Wounded Knee. So both those tragic losses really began the work of finding justice for Indigenous women. So you could say that search for justice has been over 50 years. But more recently, with the work of the National Native Women's Association of Canada and Amnesty International and the Stolen Sisters report, the tragedy and scope of missing and murdered women then became known in the country as indeed, being national in scope and not losing momentum, I guess. And when we look at, I suppose, more globally and on the long view historically, that much of the violence faced by Indigenous women and girls has really been as a result of the colonial powers, where the Indian Act failed to recognize the equality of Indigenous women within their communities, and continued, throughout the years, with Indigenous women having to demand and take Canada as a colonial government to court to ensure that there be a level of recognition. Well, the goal was equality. It's still not there yet. So we have those systemic and colonial practices that have been impacting the loss of women and girls and two-spirited people. And Hilda will speak more to the issues around how it impacts particularly northern and small communities outside of the urban center. But I guess the other thing that I want to add is that while the RCMP stated in their 2014 report that there was 1,181 Indigenous women that have been murdered or gone missing, in fact, it's probably much more than that. Those are the only talking about reported cases. What about the unreported cases? And that's really a big issue. So I'm just going to move over to Hilda and talk about the impact on smaller communities, and then maybe we can talk about some of the recommendations of the National Inquiry. We have to say that we do not work for the National Inquiry, that we are advocates and co-chairs for the Manitoba Coalition, which is a volunteer
volunteer group.
It's a volunteer group, yeah. And we are volunteers.
So I'm just going to speak a little bit to the context of the lived experience of Indigenous women and girls who live in our First Nation communities, especially those who live in remote, isolated communities here in Manitoba, and not even in Manitoba. I would say across Canada, many of the communities have the same challenges and barriers when it comes to allowing Indigenous women and girls to thrive in their environments. So I know, like in Manitoba, some of our communities, our First Nation communities, some of them still live in third world conditions without running water and having to use slop pails, and they don't have access to quality education. There's a lot of homelessness that happens, and many times governments call it overcrowding, but in reality, it's homelessness, because if you don't have nowhere to go, you have to find somewhere to stay, and many times there's over 30 people living in a home in a northern First Nation community house, and there's also access to food security, food sustainability. The cost of food is very high in a lot of our northern remote communities. So having a healthy, balanced diet is very difficult, and a lot of times people will go to the land to find their food sources, and sometimes that's not easy to do, especially with the extreme weather conditions and stuff like that. So there's different things that individuals try to do to, try to find food sustainability in our communities, as well as access to health. Many of the communities do not have hospitals. They have what we call nursing stations, where it's staffed by a nurse. Sometimes there's a full-time nurse, sometimes there isn't. And there's doctors that come in, I would say weekly, right, Sandra, most of the time? Yeah, and then, depending on if there's doctors available and stuff like that. And there's a constant change in doctors, so it makes it very difficult to be able to, have a doctor who provides you constant care when there's constant changes. There could be the quality of the healthcare suffers as well. And when we talk about education too, many times in our First Nation communities, there's a challenge, because of the way that the federal government funds education. We don't get access to the same quality or quantity of education as individuals who live in major urban centers do. So that really impacts our communities and is a great challenge. And there's a lot of poverty in our communities too, and it's very difficult to, for our women and girls in our communities to have hope when you're living in extreme poverty. It seems like, when you're living in poverty, you're looking on how you're going to survive the next day. It's very hard to have hope and to build a future when you're wondering where your next meal is coming from, or, how are you going to stay warm. And there's a lack of economic opportunities as well as in our First Nation communities. And why I'm sharing all of this is because all of this has impacts on how Indigenous women and girls thrive in our communities. If we had access to quality education, quality childcare, housing, food sustainability, health, economic opportunities, we would grow up to be, be able to have, having those opportunities would allow us to be able to thrive and to grow in a good environment where everything is provided and not, struggling all the time. And many people think that First Nations have an endless pot of money, but that's not true. If you do the math and kind of against the population and the needs, it's like Peter stealing from Paul, just to address different needs that are occurring and crises in our communities. And as well, we've had a loss of our language and our culture, and that's really impactful too. Not knowing who you are, where you come from is really impactful to the strength of our women and girls. And also, and stuff like that is on how society views us too. Racism is a huge part in it, especially with institutional racism, whether it be child welfare, healthcare systems, policing systems, justice systems. All those have huge impacts on how Indigenous women and girls are treated. Not only Indigenous women and girls, but Indigenous people as a whole. So we really need to address that institutional racism, and why I bring that up too is because that's what we hope that national inquiry will shed a light on, is the institutional racism that's so prevalent in many of these institutions that are supposed to provide services and support Indigenous people as a whole. And I also want to talk about our resilience as Indigenous women and girls. When you look at all the barriers that are against us, we're very strong and we're very resilient, and we continue to thrive regardless of our challenges. And I just want society to know that as a whole, that we're resilient and we're strong. And if we're given opportunities, we could really flourish, and our hopes can become dreams, and those dreams can become reality if we're provided equal opportunity like every other Canadian across this country. And I know with the National Inquiry, I'm not sure if some of you have watched some of the testimony, especially from families, but I just caution you, if you're watching the testimony, that you ensure that you have some types of supports with you, because it could be, really traumatizing as well to hear the lived experiences of these families and survivors who have a missing or murdered loved one. And also, if you have an opportunity to listen into some of the presentations from parties withstanding with the institutional expert panel hearings, I recommend that you do that as well if you want to further educate yourself on what is happening across this country we call Canada. And you could watch that on CPAC. If you Google it, they'll have like the different archived footage of hearings from the National Inquiry. And for me, like, I'm also an impacted family member, and I've seen and experienced personally the institutional racism of the RCMP. I'll just share an example with you. When my sister died, 19 hours after she was found dead, there was a fire in her garage that she'd been partying in the night before, and the RCMP had the audacity to say to me, "Isn't it customary when an Indigenous woman dies that they deliberately burn the home down?" And I was just really taken aback by it, like, even to say that kind of thing to me when my family was in a state of grief and shock because losing my sister, and to have a police officer say that to me, and the level and I would say the quantity and the quality of the investigation that was done was really disappointing for my family. And I know this is common across the country. We've heard it several times from other families on how policing is huge when it comes to investigations of Indigenous women and girls, and how families are treated, the racist comments, and like I said, the lack of quantity and quality of services that they receive compared to a non-Indigenous woman who has gone missing or who has been murdered. And I don't say that to discriminate, I just say that to make a point and a comparison, because I feel that all women and girls deserve equal, opportunities for services that are provided. And the inquiry's mandate was, I guess, for 2.5 years now. They received a 6-month extension. And from my perspective, I don't feel that, there was enough money committed to the National Inquiry or enough time, given its huge mandate that it was, required to undertake to look at the systemic causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls. And you're only given, like, initially they were only given 2 days two years to fulfill their mandate, but they had to start from scratch and build a machine that was big enough to undertake such a complex issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So in many ways, I feel that, it was rushed, and a lot of families and survivors felt that it was rushed, and there was a lot of challenges within the inquiry itself, with some of the, changeover in staff. It really impacted families and survivors. It, really created a lot of instability among the National Inquiry when it came to, reassuring families and survivors that this was a safe place to tell your story. But I also know that, there's a little bit of mixed feelings about that too, because some families felt that they felt re-victimized and re-traumatized by the National Inquiry, but many families and survivors felt that it was a place of healing for them. It was a place for them to tell their story and to leave their story and to go forward on their healing journey. And so from that, I'm just going to sort of like go forward and some of the things, that we're doing when it comes to working with families and survivors and healing. So in my role as the manager of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Liaison Unit within MKO. I've been in the role for a little over a year, and we're working on our third healing gathering where we're providing families and survivors with tools on helping them go forward in their journey of grief and loss, but never taking that away from them and telling them how to heal or what they need to heal. We just offer different tools, whether it be, we're deeply rooted in the cultural aspect of our healing when it comes to ceremony and providing different tools that, come from a cultural aspect for healing. And then we also have different therapists who will be on site, and traditional, our grandmothers in our Indigenous community play a huge role when they create safety environments and a place of healing for Indigenous women and girls and their families. So they're really instrumental in our healing gatherings too, and our men play a huge role too in our healing. And families really enjoy coming to the healing gatherings, and we also connect them with other tools in the community to heal from the loss of their loved one, or especially with families who don't have closure for when their loved one is missing. It's very extremely difficult for them, and you see the impacts and when you don't know where your loved one is and you don't have closure, it creates a lot of mental anguish, and it affects the health of the individual as well as the health of the whole family. It's very difficult for them not to know where their loved one is and to not have that closure. But it's also equally difficult for families who have had a loved one who has been murdered. And I always say, as an Indigenous woman in Canada, that we have the right to live, we have the right to feel safe, and it is very frustrating when you continuously share recommendations. Prior to the national inquiry occurring, there's over 1,200 recommendations that have been put forth by advocates such as Sandra and I, family members, survivors, communities, and you're not seeing a lot of those recommendations implemented by the Canadian government. And it's very frustrating to observe that when you see every day, across Canada, we're losing Indigenous women and girls either to murder or, they're going missing. And we also see the child welfare system having a huge impact on MMIWG. We consider that to be a major gateway to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because when you fracture a family, it's very difficult, for a child, when a child is apprehended from the home, and not to grow up with the culture, the language, and the family environment. There's other ways that the governments can look at child welfare, working holistically with the family and supporting the family as a whole if there's some challenges within the family. But in many circumstances where children, Indigenous children, are apprehended, there was no need for an apprehension. There could have been an alternative mechanism that is used. And for those children and that mother, when they're separated like that, they go through a grieving process, because that's a great loss. Especially when it comes to, we have in Manitoba itself, we have a high percentage of Indigenous children in care. We have over 11,000 children in care here, and they have a mechanism within the child welfare system that they call birth alerts, and where babies are apprehended right at birth from the hospital. The mother only gets to spend a day or two with the baby, then the baby's apprehended. And for me, I think that's very destructive, and that really has to change. There's a whole, we could talk for hours on child welfare, but I just wanted to share a little bit on that. You can also do some research yourself on the impacts of child welfare in the Indigenous community and how it plays such a huge role in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because we also know that a lot of our girls who are in care are being sexually exploited, because they're not, I just find that it's going into the child welfare system and how vulnerable and lost they are, considering that their family has been fractured, that they, end up in really vulnerable situations where there's predators out there who are sexually exploiting them. And we know that's happening and the numbers are increasing, and I think we're to the point where we could say it's almost a crisis with how many young Indigenous girls are being sexually exploited within the child welfare system itself. Do you want to say a little more on that?
Yeah,
Sandra?
so I just want to come back to the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba that was co-chaired by now Senator Marie Sinclair and the late Alvin Hamilton. They did a separate report into the death of Helen Betty Osborne and found that she had died only because she was an Aboriginal woman, and that the justice system had failed her. And we continue to see that happening where a year ago, the justice system failed Tina Fontaine. The justice system failed Cindy Gladue. And people often compare what is happening with MMIWG to the residential schools, but we have to say that it's much worse because it is multiple systems, multiple patriarchal and colonial systems that affect the lives, the birth through death of Indigenous women and girls. A good example that Hilda had spoken about is the birth alerts and taking babies away at birth. The difference between that and the residential school systems, at least children had, the opportunity to live with their families for 4 or 5 years. So to say that these things are past tense is the wrong view because we see it happening every day, and that's the difference. This is an issue. The tragedy goes on every day in our communities, from babies being taken from mothers' arms to girls being sent to live on the streets by the child welfare system and to be exploited and trafficked, to women facing situations of domestic violence. And I think when we speak to that, even the National Inquiry, while it was meant to address the issues and to find the truth and answers, it's not quite able to do that because it is still modeled on a Western patriarchal system. And that, we feel that they've tried their best, but our big concern is for families that have shared their truth and continue to be impacted without the health supports. And, the government the federal government and provincial governments turn a blind eye to the recommendations, which called for the immediate expansion of the resolution program, health support program, to support families as they move through the process of grief, which has been reopened as a result of the inquiry, and then going forward to providing support to families and individuals on an ongoing basis. We talk about many of our women are taught or are told that they are victims or that they're survivors. But many of the young women and girls say, no, we're not victims anymore, we're not survivors, because then that would mean that we're still in that mess that Canada wants us to be in, that women and girls see themselves as warriors and as matriarchs, taking their own place, determining their own healing, determining their own lives. And I think that moving forward, we have to continue to support women and girls and two-spirited individuals taking their own space. And in fact, for the women that have been impacted by the Me Too movement, I think that all women have got to take their own space. So I'm going to just turn it over to Hilda to talk about, in Manitoba, there was a media toolkit that was developed, and it's being updated by one of the coalition partners, actually, Gani Gajic.
Well, I also wanted to share a little bit on how media has a huge role to play on how society views us as Indigenous women and girls. We've had some changes in Manitoba through, the hard work of advocates and families and survivors on how media portrays us. They portray, and many times, like previously, they would portray some of really young girls as prostitutes. Like, they're not prostitutes, they're victims of human trafficking and sexual violence, and just some of the language that they would use and some of the pictures that they would post and some of the descriptions that they would use when one of our girls went missing or was murdered. It really impacted on how society viewed us as well, and that's slightly changing in Manitoba, but there's still some challenges on some of the headlines that we see. But we also see really damaging headlines across the country, which is really upsetting to read as advocates, and more upsetting to read as family members and survivors who've been impacted by the national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So for those of you who are watching out there, I encourage you not to believe everything that media writes, especially with damaging headlines, and to challenge those systems that, create environments to perpetuate further violence against Indigenous women and girls. And there's also some really good work being done in the communities to strengthen Indigenous women and girls. And it's really impacting as well to create environments where, we can speak for ourselves and lobby for ourselves, because why I say that too is within the federal government, provincial government, whether it be municipal government, many times there's decision makers sitting at a table who believe they know what's right for us and what programming is right for us, what kind of supports we need. And I said, as an Indigenous woman, it's time for us to be sitting at those tables where decisions and discussions are being made with us and not for us, because we're really tired of provincial and federal governments thinking that they know how to fix us when they don't know how to fix us. They just know how to further perpetuate victimization of Indigenous women and girls. We know what we want, we know what we need, we know what our communities want and need, and so do our leaders. And it's time for the federal government to, change that view and allow Indigenous people to sit at those tables where decisions and discussions are being made and planning is taking place, and to really review their systems and their practices, because they're just causing further damage to Indigenous people across this country.
And we're not going anywhere. We're here to stay, and, so we don't have an expiry date, despite the many attempts by colonial and patriarchal powers to eliminate Indigenous people in this country. We're still here, and we're going to continue to be here, and continue to support our children and our families and strengthen our families. And so I think that the colonial powers have got to sit down at the table with women and girls and map out a long-term action plan that is going to allow for, the strength of Indigenous people to come forward, and not continue to see us as or provide a Band-Aid or 5-year project funding or 6-month project funding. We're here to stay, so let's find a way to recognize that within systems and change those systems to allow for women and girls to thrive, as Hilda has addressed.
I just wanted to add on to that, like, I think it shouldn't matter which government is in power. Those needs are still there, and funding should not be cut. Like, you know, in the next federal election, if we had a PC government or a different government and they slash all the programs, you know, that are currently, like, because there's some movement within the Liberal government that, you know, has been really positive. I'm not saying that they do everything bad, but there's some, you know, things occurring, and if there's a new government and then they totally change their view and go back kind of how the last progressive government treated Indigenous people, it's going to be very difficult. But at least with this current government, there's some positive things that are occurring. It's not all negative. Like, you know, we're growing together, and, you know, some things are changing for the better of Indigenous women and girls and Indigenous communities. So I just wanted, like Sandra said, like, we're not going away anytime soon, and that, you know, just because there's a change in government doesn't change our needs and our wants and the barriers that we face.
So I think if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to try to respond, or if you have any comments that you'd like to make that would be helpful for us in our work, we would appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Hilda, and thank you, Sandra. We have some questions that have come in. So the first question is, so in terms of the inquiry, where is the process now? And for those who are interested, and I think that's everybody on this call, when are the findings of the inquiry going to be released to the public?
Mm-hmm.
2019.
Yeah. Well, right now, like, the inquiry right now, what's happening is they're doing the final oral submissions.
Yeah.
This week it's in Calgary, and next week it's in Ottawa from the 10th to the 14th, where parties withstanding will present their oral submissions. And then from then there'll be a final written submission that is required to be submitted, and I believe the final report will come out June 2019.
Yeah. And the coalition will be presenting their our final submission on December 10th
at 9 a.m. So they also live stream all the like all the hearings on their Facebook page as well as CPAC, so you can tune in and watch them.
Okay. So as a follow-up to that, you know, you don't have to be overly cynical to wonder whether the report of a government commission is going to actually, you know, take flight, or whether it's going to land on a bookshelf somewhere and never move. So what can the wider community, outside of the Indigenous community, do to become allies, not only to end violence against Indigenous women and girls, but also, I suppose, in a respectful way, you know, to hold the government's feet to the fire, to make sure that the recommendations of the Commission actually make a difference in the lives of the Indigenous community?
Well, we don't have to wait until the report, because the inquiry did issue an interim report with 10 recommendations that governments can act on immediately, and you know, it's important to note that Cindy Blackstock has 5 human rights rulings to provide equity of services for Indigenous children that is still not happening. So, you know, having to write to and approach their federal MPs on the implementation of the 10 recommendations is critical, and to have the conversations in the community about, you know, what are people's perceptions and how can we support a move to equality for Indigenous women and girls.
I also wanted to add. We also wanted to add. Sorry, we just got interrupted, but we'll be right back. We just also wanted to, I wanted to add further to that, when we talk about how can community help, I think it's really important that, communities have compassion and understanding when it comes to Indigenous communities. And with that, I think, with compassion and understanding comes relationship building. Although society portrays us as a burden to Canada, we actually are not a burden to Canada. We've shared our space with Canada. So I just want people to remember that.
In the course of your presentation, you made reference to both birth alerts and to the manner in which the child welfare system continues to treat the Indigenous community. One of our member of our audience has asked, what, if anything, is being done to somehow, limit what seems to be the almost unlimited power, right, of the child welfare system to interfere in a destructive way in your community?
Well, I know, in Manitoba currently, with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Mamaway, the Manitoba Kiwatnik, everybody's taking different approaches, whether it be writing their own Indigenous family law or legal framework, or providing different supports for families. But there's a lot of really good things going on in Manitoba to challenge that child welfare system, create that change that's needed. Because the less apprehensions we have, the stronger the families are. So there's a lot of really good things going on in Manitoba.
It's also important to recognize that women and girls are often taken away from, or second or third generation taken away from their birth families, and so don't have the support of families and communities when they end up in a medicalized process to give birth. And so the reintroduction of traditional birthing practices through having doulas present and midwives present that will support the mom as she prepares for birth and does it in a way that's respective of their traditions and culture, as well as being in a safe, supportive environment. To be able to have birth in your community, surrounded by family and on the land, I think will create a different process, because in many of our communities it's been over 50 years since the first cry or the first laugh of a child is heard in that community. So births are not able to be celebrated, mothers are not able to be celebrated, or families are not able to be celebrated because of the quietness, the silence around birth. What we often see in our communities is where death is often acknowledged across the community. So we hear those cries, the cries of sadness, the cries of grief, but we don't hear the cries of joy that come with birth and being connected, for babies to be connected and mothers to be connected to the land and community. So to be able to change that, I think, is another way of shifting the process for Indigenous women and girls and their families to be grounded.
I just wanted to add a little more onto that. I went to a forum on poverty last year, and there was an elder there from Cross Lake, and he made a statement that has always really stuck with me. He said, the most beautiful grand entry into this world is the birth of a child. you know, and that should be that experience for many of our mothers, you know, who are giving birth, that, you know, they should be able to enjoy that beauty and not have it taken away from them, because that is really devastating. And like I said, if they take approach, like it's called Child and Family Services, but it's like the family is missing in it. It's so focused on apprehension versus prevention, you know, and I think, and what we see a lot of is when a child is apprehended at birth, it's like a life of institutionalization for that child. You know, when they're taken from the only family they've known, there's a lot of language, culture, and connection to community. And from the hospital, you know, they grow up and they end up in youth detention centers, and they end up in prisons or a hospital, basically. So that's why it's so important. And in Manitoba, there's many people, like I mentioned, like AMC, Mama Way, MKO, and other organizations who are working to really create that shift, because we have the highest number of children in care. And like I said earlier, child welfare is a major gateway to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions about funding, so I'm going to try and put them together. So, have federal and provincial governments increased funding to support missing MMIWG families? For example, have you seen an increase in funding for programs and services, funding to change policies and practices? As our audience member says, you know, apologies and good intentions are nice, but they have no teeth if nothing is done. A second question that I'm going to mash together with this has to do with the way that funding is provided from the federal government to Indigenous communities. The member of the audience says, you know, they believe that a lot of this funding flows through the Indian Act, and they wonder, you know, if this is really the most effective or efficient way of, you know, of delivering assistance, or if it has to be done in a tiered way through federal, provincial, and municipal funding.
Well, I think what's really important, what we have said, is that many of the systems are patriarchal and colonial in nature, and as a result, you know, are not even in acknowledging the voice and abilities of Indigenous women. So being able to work in relationship with, you know, if it's in community, and acknowledging who those community leaders and advocates are, who will, you know, and most importantly, is recognizing the strength and ability of survivors and families to make those decisions about what happens to resources, financial or otherwise, that support, you know, the effective emancipation of Indigenous people in this country.
And I just wanted to add on a little further to that. Like like in my role, I'm currently funded $200,000 a year that where I work with 27 Northern Manitoba First Nations, and I also work within urban centers in Thompson and Winnipeg and other rural communities. Like, that's not a lot of money, you know, to provide adequate supports and resources. It's very limited, and if I wasn't constantly writing other proposals or getting in-kind supports, my role wouldn't be that meaningful. And there's a real need to address funding issues and increase that funding to make it really meaningful to those who need it the most, families and survivors, and, you know, Indigenous communities as a whole, like, to be able to thrive.
There is no direct funding to Indigenous women or Indigenous women-led organizations that deal specifically with this issue, other than FILU, which Hilda's organization is supported by on an annual basis. There's no movement for long-term or, you know, long longitudinal view of creating change. It's like things are from a 6 months to 5 years, whatever the funding or political cycle is for federal and provincial governments. But there is no government, federal or provincial, in this country that has any kind of dedicated funding and action plan and implementation of an action plan to address this issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls.
And I just wanted to elaborate a little more on that because, like, my role is only funded until 2020, and I've been in the role for about a year and a few months, and I always feel like, am I really impacting families and survivors? Like, what's going to happen when I leave? It's like I've given them all this hope and, started helping them go forward on their journeys, and then it comes to an abrupt halt. Like, what happens after that? Like, I don't feel that it's fair to families and survivors if the funding doesn't continue, and if it doesn't expand, and really address the barriers that exist for Indigenous women and girls, not only when it comes to missing and murder, but, from basically birth until death.
So a bit of a mashup question. What I've heard today, amongst many things, is that the inquiry and what is the inquiry isn't about what was experienced. It's about what was experienced and about what is being experienced. It's a tragedy in the present tense rather than one that's in the past tense. But so when I consider that, and when I consider what you said about how it took 15 years to gather the political will to begin the inquiry, I guess the question is, how much confidence do you have that the political will be there to help end violence against women and girls, and whether that takes the form of funding or leadership from the front? And again, beyond writing to members of parliament, what can we do in order, to stiffen the spines of our leaders to ensure that this tragedy becomes one that happened in the past tense and is no longer, current news?
I think for me, I would like to see a real focus on accountability, holding governments accountable. When this report comes out, there needs to be a mechanism to hold them accountable, to see the full implementation of the recommendations from the National Inquiry, and not only those recommendations that are sitting on shelves collecting dust right now. Like, I'm optimistic, but I'm also hesitant because of, the past histories that we've seen and we've witnessed as Indigenous women and girls, the lack of political will that's out there. And I think, as individuals who are watching, that's a question that each of you should be asking your member of parliament. What is your political will to support the protection of Indigenous women and girls?
We've had you've both spoken on a number of occasions this afternoon about the patriarchal systems and the colonial systems that have kind of contributed to this state of affairs. You've also spoken about the various systems, naming them particularly the justice system, the child welfare system. What occurs to us is it possible, that the state of these systems has actually had not only a direct but an indirect effect on violence against women? And I guess what the questioner is asking, is if government doesn't value the lives of these women and girls, then in essence, doesn't that almost encourage violence against them, by individual actors? There's no penalty because nobody cares. These are lives that aren't worth considering.
Well, that's absolutely correct. If the government is not willing to, governments are not willing to make a change And it really also it goes to municipal governments as well. You know, what kind of support do they give their police forces to do adequate investigations or adequate prevention? We're fortunate in Winnipeg that the Bear Clan has a very active presence in the community, particularly in the parts of the community that are most vulnerable. And Bear Clan are primarily Indigenous people that patrol the streets, and they have a good relationship with the municipal police force as well. So they're able to collaborate. And I think that, you know, governments have failed to provide any go-forward position, and that is strength-based, looking at ways that we can turn the situation around by providing positive, strength-based processes that will keep women and girls free from violence, but also as a society to be able to teach non-Indigenous people, to be able to teach men and boys to value Indigenous women and girls and to value women and girls, I think is the greatest kind of education we can provide to society. But that responsibility for providing education is not solely the responsibility of Indigenous women and girls or Indigenous people or Indigenous organizations. Those are things that can be done within mainstream institutions with, of course, the input and support of Indigenous scholars or activists. I think that even around the issue of reconciliation, that it has been primarily driven by Indigenous people and organizations, when really, once the truth of residential schools came out, that reconciliation process is something that needed to be driven and activated by the systems that created it. And we think, or I think, in this case, in this ongoing national crisis, that it is as well something that needs to be certainly directed by Indigenous women and girls, survivors and their families, but it needs to be implemented by those systems that continue to perpetuate the violence.
I just wanted to add a little more to what Sandra said when it comes to, you know, with the government. I think they need to provide adequate funding for Indigenous communities as well as Indigenous women and girls to be able to draft their own legislation, you know, and perhaps to have that legislation enacted. I think that's really important, and that's when you're going to see a huge shift as well when it comes to all these, you know, all the legislation that exists and all the policies that discriminate against Indigenous women and girls and fail to protect the lives of Indigenous women and girls.
We have a comment and we also have a question. So the comment from one of our audience members is, I just want to say thank you for your strength and courage to take on this advocacy work. I appreciate your comment around the complexity of colonial structures and systems and how it continues to impact Indigenous peoples on so many different levels. For example, housing, education, and economic growth, and so forth. The question from another audience member is, how can government support public awareness and education on reconciliation and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls issue, we see lots of examples of racism in community sports and recreation against Indigenous children lately. It's not just the politicians we have to reach, it's the public and the fellow Canadians as well.
Well, those bodies, those sports bodies, and particularly I know I mentioned with the hockey bodies, can justify racist or discriminatory practices by other means. And it's just up to those bodies, other than government, to be able to look at their practices and their justifications for continuing to perpetuate the harms against Indigenous women and girls and change them. They should just feel compelled to create a better place for all people.
And I also wanted to add, it's not only governments that need to create that change, it's also society as a whole. As Canadians, everybody needs to be part of the change and part of the solution. We all have a responsibility on what our behaviors are and what our actions are. And if we choose, that racist, discriminatory, violent behavior, that's a choice that individual makes. But if, there's other choices that can be made, like I said, if you have compassion, you have understanding, that's how relationships are built. But if you continue to have discriminatory, racist behaviors, it's very difficult to change that. And I don't think any amount of campaigns can change that. It's up to each individual to be responsible and to be accountable for their actions.
When there is policies and practices in place, it's up to individuals, not just Indigenous women, to be able to stand up and ask the questions about why certain policies or practices or procedures are implemented or maintained, and to be able to challenge those processes within their organizations, whether it's a local nonprofit or if it's a church group or a team. Let's have that discussion, not to be afraid to ask the questions, and if necessary, challenge the answers, because it really does start on the ground. We can't push it off on government, but it's really reflected in our daily behaviors, the actions we allow. And I think we just need to be able to push back, and if somebody takes a stand, not ostracize them, but ask the questions and find the solutions.
There has to be accountability there too, if we allow these behaviors to continue and if we condone them, it just, it perpetuates further violence and racism. There has to be some mechanisms in place that holds these individuals accountable. Otherwise, we're not going to see real change occur.
Yes. It's in a way what you are saying echoes, I suppose, comments that were made by members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when they stressed that the work of reconciliation isn't simply about government in conversation with the Indigenous community, but rather it's everyone's business, whether you're a well-settled Canadian or whether you are a newcomer, or whether you're a member of one of the churches or not, that this is a national project. So similarly, dealing with the challenge of violence against Indigenous women and girls, it's not just the government's role to fix it, it's everyone's role to fix it as well. A question from an audience member who is in Thunder Bay, and she says, or they say, I should say, I live and work in Thunder Bay. I'm the Indigenous liaison at the Thunder Bay Public Library and currently working on implementing TRC recommendations as they relate to library services. It might be a little premature, but I'm wondering if there are any ways that you can see the Public Library Service responding to the MMIWG inquiry and its recommendations.
I think by being able to provide a venue to review the recommendations, to be able to provide a discussion group with where the recommendations, starting now with the recommendations of the interim report, create a community conversation within that public space, and to be able to work with municipalities, because most public libraries are under the municipalities, to be able to work with the municipalities in moving forward with their own action plan, I think is critical. And I know that Thunder Bay has had, I think it was last week, where there was an incident with one of their police officers manhandling an Indigenous girl on a stretcher. So being able to have that public conversation with all parties is a good way to start, and really commend the public library in asking the question and having those discussions.
I agree with Sandra, offering those spaces and those opportunities, whether it be the library or if anybody's watching, so whether it be the environment that you work in or volunteer in, it's providing those spaces to create the talk, to create understanding, to have that compassion.
We have one last question, but I will ask it slowly so that if there are any other questions out there, you'll have a chance to type them. This question has to do with the participation of Indigenous people in politics. I'm going to change the wording a little bit. What is from your point of view, what are the barriers to Indigenous participation in politics at the different levels, and do you see Indigenous participation as being critical to making progress, and do you see progress being made in terms of getting more individuals from your community involved in politics as elected officials?
I think it's important to get more Indigenous people involved in politics where key decisions are being made, but like I said previously, it's also important to have those people where discussions and decisions and planning is taking place too. And I think Indigenous people as a whole have been kind of jaded by, like Sandra described, the systems that have continuously failed us, that a lot of them don't vote, and we're trying to encourage the importance of voting within the Indigenous communities. There's been different movements that have been created, like even in Winnipeg, like Rock the Vote, for all of Manitoba to vote in the federal election, provincial election, and even city elections. There's a real wave of going on the importance of voting. And some of the barriers, what would you say some of the barriers are, Sandra, for Indigenous people entering politics?
Well, I think certainly there's the financial part of running for elected office. There is the systemic discrimination as well as a barrier. But I also think that, politics is just one way of moving the bar. There's also has to be representation at a corporate level as well. So if there are provincial or national boards and commissions that inform policy-making decisions, that there should also be Indigenous women's voices at the table.
Thank you very much for that. We have no further questions, but before we close, to our audience member from Thunder Bay, we received a message from someone in Winnipeg saying that the Winnipeg Public Library hosts sessions, and you should contact with the Indigenous community and organizations in Winnipeg to see what they're doing and develop perhaps some strategies based on best practices. That said, Hilda and Sandra, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom with us today. As you've said, this is a tragedy in the present tense, but it's the responsibility of all Canadians in order to make this tragedy something that goes into the past tense. So I say to you and to the other members of the audience who joined us today, merci bien, thank you very much, miigwech, and best of the season to everyone, right? And stay safe, and let's have a good holiday season and a very good new year. Thank you.
Thank you so much.